Hello, and welcome to a presentation on the uniqueness or particularity of Jesus Christ. This presentation is done as a response to religious pluralism. Um, this speech will look at the response to the challenge of religious pluralism. Example is which often questions the Christian faith claim that Jesus is the only way to salvation. And so we want to look at that from an apologetic standpoint. And more than that, we want to address it from um, uh, the viewpoint of Apostle Peter when he addressed his audience there in the book of Acts, chapter number 2. And so we'll just look at that just so we can get kind of a foundation by which we want to operate from. So Acts chapter 2, and here in verse 14, Peter is addressing the crowd. I just want to look at maybe one or two verses here. Then Peter stood up with the 11, raised his voice, and addressed the crowd. Fellow Jews, and all you who live in Jerusalem, let me explain this to you. Listen carefully to what I say. That is verse number 14. And then he continues in 15. He said, These people are not drunk as you suppose. And then when we kind of just go over to, in the same chapter, verse 22, Peter's still addressing his audience, but now he is going to another portion of his audience, which are probably one and the same, but let's just look at this for what it is. And verse 22 out of the book of Acts, chapter 2, fellow Israelites, listen to this. Jesus of Nazareth was a man accredited by God to you by miracles, wonders, and signs, which God did among you through him, as you yourselves know. This man, 23, this man handed over to you by God deliberate plan and foreknowledge, and you, with the help of wicked men, put him to death by nailing him to the cross. And so Peter, first of all, specifically addresses his audience. First of all, he addresses the Jewish audience, and then he addresses also the Israelite. This is important in that he's doing it from a perspective where he can begin to bridge history together, and where he begins to present his gospel message to this audience. But he does it in such a way that he starts out in verse 17. Well, not starts out, but this is how he is connecting the dots to both the Jewish history as well as the Israelite history. And he begins to say in verse 17, in the last days, God says, I will pour out my spirit on all people. Pardon me, your sons and your daughters will prophesy. Your young men will see visions. Your old men will dream dreams. And prior to even him getting there, back up to 16, where he says, no, in response to the people thinking that this audience was drunk with wine and spirits and so forth, he says, no, this is what was spoken by the prophet Joel. And then he gets into it in verse 17, in the last days, God says. And so Peter begins to address his audience from their Jewish roots as well as the Israelite roots. He is connecting history to the present moment. As an apologist, that's what we want to do. We want to connect to our audience in a way where we present the gospel, and we present it in a way where they can uh, themselves begin to reason within their own minds as to the validity of this gospel. In Christianity Today, I jotted this down. It says, and I quote, since the Enlightenment, apologetics has primarily been conceived as a defense of the reasonableness of Christianity. He says that since the Enlightenment apologetics. And so when we think about reasonableness, we think about it from, again, the perch where uh, we cannot be responsible for another person's thinking. However, we can bring reason to our presentation, our defense of the gospel. And I believe that is what Peter's doing here. He is reasoning with his audience so that his audience begins to understand that, first of all, the present situation that we find ourselves in, these people are not drunk as in wine or merriment or spirits, but this is that the prophet Joel has spoken in the last days. And so he connects his audience. So then the plausibility of Jesus Christ. He is presenting a gospel that is uh, probable in so much as he has, first of all, joined or connected history. And I love something here that in his book, Alistair F. McGrath wrote relative to C.S. Lewis, and he says, I quote, I believe in Christianity as I believe that the sun has risen, not only because I see it, but because by it I see everything else. What an awesome statement. By it I see everything else. And so the plausibility of Christ's coming, the plausibility of the cross, and the probableness of his sacrifice. He says, by this I see everything else. And so he begins to he establishes a base whereby everything makes sense. It makes sense because I see Jesus. One of the most important things that I've learned as I begin to study this is that it is the gospel message that is of utmost importance. Um, and what Peter does from the standpoint of the book of Acts, chapter number 2, and beginning at 14, verse 14, is that he doesn't change the centricity or the very core or the essence of the gospel. He actually he now finds himself in a situation where the he found himself, I should say, in a situation where the outpouring of the Holy Spirit was a result of the prophecies that came before, and so he's not trying to present some pie in the sky dream. He is actually presenting what has already been spoken, and he is addressing, if you will, the reasonableness of the people in the audience, because it is apparent to me in reading this text and reading this narrative that the people at some point had heard this. Otherwise, it would have been of little use for him to even bring that up. He brings it up because he knows that his Jewish and his Israelite audience is familiar with Joel the prophet and familiar with what he spoke in the last days. So then, in keeping in line with Jesus and the plausibility of Jesus, Hebrews chapter 1, the author wrote this, chapter 1, verse 1. In the past, God spoke to our ancestors through the prophets at many times and in various ways. But in these last days, he has spoken to us by his Son, whom he appointed heirs of all things, and through whom also he made the universe. The Son is the radiance of God's glory and the exact representation of his being, sustaining all things by his powerful word. Jesus has been spoken of since long ago, times past. And so when we see Peter then addressing his audience as it relates to the history of that audience, we see the plausibility of Jesus being seen throughout the Bible, throughout the Old Testament, the New Testament. He is the probability of him being who he is probable because of the history from which he comes. He is the from the line of David.